Welcome into the Hot Read Podcast. I'm your host, Easton Freeze, director of published content here at BroadwaySportsMedia.com. We're also brought to you by the 440 Podcast Network, and you can follow me on social media at Easton Freeze. I'm joined, as always, by producer JT, who you can follow on social media at JT_Ruhnke. And we have a really special episode for you all today. If you're listening with us live, we appreciate you being here. You're in for a treat. We are joined by a very special guest today, Randy Mueller, who is a former NFL GM, gracious enough to give us some of his time today, talking about the Titans and the offseason that we're about to embark upon. Randy, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great, guys. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. We are going to spend the next 30, 40 minutes talking about a number of different topics. You've got a very timely article out at The Athletic right now, which is where you're currently working. You went through in your opinion, the top 150 free agents available this time around, and a lot of really fantastic insight in there that I want to pick your brain about, as well as the fact that you were a former NFL GM, just to give some folks who are listening a little bit of a background on where you come from. You were the 2000 NFL Executive of the Year, spent 17 years as an exec with the Seahawks. Then you were the GM of the Saints in 2001, GM of the Dolphins from 05 to 07, and then spent 10 years with the Chargers as the senior executive of football ops over there. So a lengthy track record, been around the league for a while, knows the ins and the outs of how these things work. And with the Titans having a relatively new GM and a brand new head coach with a brand new head coaching staff, I thought it'd be great to get you on to get your perspective on all the change that's going on here in Tennessee. So here's my first question for you along those lines, Randy. I was listening to your fantastic podcast that you co-host with Mike Sando, the Football GM podcast on the Athletic Podcast Network. And you guys were talking, I think, on this last episode about hiring your friends and going about a hiring process with people you know versus people you don't know. And you were talking about it in the context of this new Washington staff where they put together a really unfamiliar group of guys. And that can be a little bit concerning. You look at the Giants and how that went for them recently, the Panthers and how that went for them last year. Mike Vrabel, when he was here, got a lot of flack from fans and the media for constantly hiring his buddies. But I think there's some validity to the idea that you need to have some familiarity with the folks you're working with. So in your experience in the league, how do you balance hiring people you know versus hiring the best guys for the job?
Well, the balance is to find both, right? I'm not for hiring friends. That's not what I would stand for at all. But I would like to have some familiarity with the people I'm down the hall from me. I would say this, and I use this when I hired Jim Haslett at the Saints, who ended up being the NFL Coach of the year I won the executive board. We knew of each other enough to know that when he came on board, I knew exactly what I was getting. There was no learning curve. We jumped in. I knew he would it's going to sound crazy, but I knew he'd set his whole life aside, his personal life, to take on this task. And I knew what we would get at the end of each day. And it was really ended up, we were there at 2 a.m. and back at 5 a.m. And we understood how each other worked. And so the familiarity that you speak with, I think is valuable for two standpoints. One, you know what you're getting down the road from a qualified, let's just say, partner. And two, you also understand that the ups and downs aren't going to change that person. So there's no learning curve. Your vision is the same. And I think that helps when you can hit the ground running with both of you on the same page.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Looking at Ran Carthon, the Titans GM, something that he's done that's kind of befuddling to those of us in this media market, and you may or may not have any thoughts on this. He comes in and takes over for John Robinson after he gets fired mid-season in the 22 season. He comes in where, when you're a GM coming into a situation in the spring, the team's scouting staff is already down that road of looking into the free agency pool, looking into the draft. That whole process is already pretty far along. And so different guys handle it different ways with how they want to eventually get their guys into the building, install their scouting staff. But with Ran, he kept pretty much the entire scouting staff on the staff throughout that first spring, and he's kept them till now. He's still rocking and rolling with those guys. When you came into different situations as the GM, how did you handle bringing in your own group of guys and getting guys that you're comfortable with under you in the scouting group?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and really a point of emphasis that everybody kind of does it a little different. I remember when I went from Seattle after 17 years to New Orleans, I had 4 guys with me on the same plane. When I flew to New Orleans, they came with me. So I brought some guys with me from Seattle and kind of blended some of the guys that were still there. Now, we were going to a Saints team that had been god awful for several years. So we had to change some things around quickly. And I wanted to put a new spin on it, not disrespecting those that had been there before, but I knew we needed to have a new vision and some new eyeballs on the operation. Same thing when I went to Miami with Nick Saban. I brought 2 or 3 guys with me from New Orleans. And so they came immediately. Some can't get out of a deal, but eventually I wanted to give the guys that were there a chance. And I believe this, you've got to give the people that are there a chance, because they may have just been loyal to the decision makers who kind of got off on a different path. So you've got to give them a chance. I think anytime you take a job like this, like Ran did, I'd say probably a third of the people are really good and are going to work for anybody and be successful. A third are kind of on the fence that they need to prove themselves. And there's probably a third that probably need to go, frankly, and change is good. So just from a thumbnail sketch, and every franchise is different, I would think that there would have been some more changes for sure in Rand's case, but maybe he feels really comfortable with the guys that are there. I don't know at the end of the day who's allowed to do what in the hierarchy of some of these offices, but I would definitely want some people that shared my vision and understood where I was thinking and where I was going, because I couldn't be around all the time to send the message every day. So if I have a few guys who have been with me before and know what we want, because it's not about really me, it's about we, they also had that same vision and message because we had worked together for so long. It made the message disseminate around the building a lot quicker and kept us all on the same page sooner and longer.
And that's right. That's the question I kind of want to reiterate, because it's been talked about a lot in the Nashville media market. And I wanted to get your opinion on whether or not this is an overblown media fabrication. This idea that it's kind of strange that a full year into this process, he's really not fired or replaced with his guy, any of these guys on the scouting staff. Does that strike you as kind of strange?
That's a little strange. I got to give it to you. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that would be hard for me. Again, you're just accepting that everybody there is great at their job and has been doing a great job for years.
Right.
That's a hard one for me to accept. So,
well, especially when the last guy got fired mid-season for the job that they all were collectively doing, right?
Yeah. The other thing is that it might put up a red flag in this, and I know Rand a little bit. I had a couple visits with him, but the red flag I would also take from it was, so he got no relationships with the 49ers or anywhere else where those guys want to come with him. So sometimes the indication of a leader, whether it's players, coaches, staff. I know this, when I went to New Orleans, I had a lot of guys that wanted to come. We signed a bunch of players that were with me in Seattle. We signed a couple coaches that were with me in Seattle. And we kind of did the same thing on the next stop too. We brought some of those guys with us that, again, it wasn't just about our staff. It was about players, coaches, the whole culture changing. So I think you've got to make change to institute culturally a different direction for sure.
And was that guys reaching out to you? They hear the news that Randy gets the head job. Hey, I want to come work with you. What can I do? Where can I fit in on the staff?
Yeah, for the most part, I had been with some guys that it was a given that they were going to come. They wanted to come. There was a little bit of a regime change in Seattle at that time. Mike Holmgren had come in. We had all been there for a year with Mike, and then I elected to move on. They wanted to come too because we had been together for a long time, but others from other franchises kind of wanted to come as well. And where I really saw the influx of people wanting to come on board was player-wise. A lot of our players knew our relationships. I was always, and still am, kind of a people person. I enjoy my time with agents. I enjoy my time building relationships with agents and other people. And it just so happened that these guys wanted to get in line with us. And I think it was beneficial for us because it allowed us to have a quicker effect on change at our new stop because of the amount of messengers we had within the building.
And that makes sense. And in fairness to Ram, we did see that a little bit on the player front. He brings in Aziz Al-Shaair, who is a former Niner. He brings in Arden Key, who was a former 49er. So that tracks a little bit. I want to shift our conversation to the free agency period we're about to enter into, and then the draft. And I want to get your thoughts on philosophically how teams should and should not approach these two avenues for building their team up, adding talent and getting better. A lot is made in the draft about the philosophical differences between drafting the best player available and drafting for need. Maybe we can start there. When you were the one pulling the levers, how did you approach that question? What do you think the best avenue is for teams to improve?
Well, what I always used is, you have to use both of them together. You've got to have a plan from 30,000 feet as to how we're going to fill these amount of issues that we have through either free agency or the draft. But what it came down to me was I didn't want to have to come to draft day and have to fill some needs. I wanted us to check as many boxes as we could prior to the draft, which then would allow me in the draft to select the best player. And I think we did really good when we were able to do that. There are sometimes you can't, and you have to draft for need. And I think that's problematic, especially if you're doing that on a consistent basis. So I wanted to sign as many veteran guys as I could to give us options in the draft. I didn't want to have to go into a draft having to pick a receiver at 10 or a guard at 12 or whatever. I wanted to have those options open to us to pick what fell to us and just let the board kind of the integrity of that board show. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was a big thing.
Let it fall the way it should. You're not reaching on anybody.
Right. Exactly. And so we did that. Now, most GMs now have all that knowledge already stored away. They have met with their scouts. They have already assembled a draft board. They should already know the depth of that draft board and where they're going to be able to select certain things depending on where they are located in the drafting sequence. Now you have your free agent board as well, and you know the strength of those players and the depth of those positions. So just use the two together to check as many boxes as we can. It's not rocket science. This is not something new. So I think you can figure out a way to make your team good based on how you attack free agency in a parallel with how you attack the draft.
When you're approaching free agency, like when you're in the position the Titans are in, and they have the most effective cap space this season, they got a lot of money to spend. Their roster is pretty barren, and so they've got a lot of holes to fill. Every year, a lot is made about what team wins free agency, right? The Jaguars did it for a number of years where they'd have a million different guys brought in on big contracts, and they would be all flash and sizzle throughout the summer, and then it wouldn't necessarily work out, and they'd win the next free agency. You never really want to be. Bill Belichick did that with New England, right? When he went out and spent a ton of money on Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith and Nelson Aguilar. It feels a little bit dangerous to have that much money to spend in free agency because you can get yourself in a lot of trouble with big name contracts. So I wanted to see if you could speak to balancing that big game hunting in free agency when you really do have a ton of very big needs on your team like the Titans do, versus shopping in that bargain bin and finding guys in a more shrewd way.
Well, I think your point is well taken. And with the Titans, for me, and I think you're saying the same thing, they need a lot of things. They don't have a lot of top quality guys.
No.
So they're going to have to find a way, I think, to ensure themselves against going big game hunting. Not one player is going to put them over the edge. And I'll just say to our listeners, because you have, what do they have, 65 million to spend.
Right.
Spending does not parallel winning. It doesn't mean you're going to be successful.
Yeah.
So making good decisions does. And I think that's the thing that we all need to keep our eye on. There are good values out there on both sides of the ball that sometimes the media doesn't know about, the fan base doesn't know about. So you can't be led by any of those voices. You've got to have conviction for your own evaluations, and then in a total different way, value those guys that you like. And then you compare it, like I said, to what's available in the draft. So it's great to have $60 million to spend. I would be shocked, and actually I would be disappointed if they spent 40 million. They don't need to. There's not that many top quality players that are going to make a big enough difference for them. They've got to be selective, and I think really undergo a change of a roster that didn't happen last year and hasn't happened there in 2 or 3 years. So they're going to have to maybe it's really quantity over quality, in my opinion, and that should be their creed entering free agency this year.
I love that. Just trying to get as many throws of the dart on the dartboard and see what hits. I'd imagine a big part of that, and maybe you can speak to this from personal experience. I'd imagine you can't go into free agency in love with the idea of landing this specific big name guy, because that's a great way to overspend on certain players. You kind of have to go in with the specific needs. Okay, I need this at this position. I need a second guy at this position, and then just see which values work best for you, right?
Well, that and the first step in the whole process is to figure out who you want to retain. The Titans got a bunch of free agents as well, and that has to
there's not many of them I'd imagine they want to retain at this point.
Well, I'll tell you this: they better find a way to keep their big guys, and because offensive linemen are hard to come by.
Sure.
And I see a couple on their list that I would definitely hang on to. I see an Autry on defense that I think I would love to hang on to. These big guys. Yeah, these big guys are hard to replace. So before we go out thinking all of our options are better than the ones we got, that'll be the first bridge that they have to cross, is they've got to retain or try to retain some of these guys. The way it works is in free agency, let's say we have 10 free agents of our own. They all have cards or the names on a card. I'm going to put them up on our free agent board to see where they fall in the patch of other defensive linemen or other offensive linemen. For example, center.
Right.
Are there centers better than our guy available? I might toy with that if there are. If not, I don't want to take a step down. So I've got to play each against another, 2 or 3 deals per se. It's all about options, and it's about selecting the right options, especially when it comes to free agency. And so it's a difficult time for experienced GMs, much less an inexperienced GM, because you have to manage probably a dozen to maybe 20 negotiations and relationships with agents and sometimes players during this time. So it is a juggling act of all kinds of levels to kind of just get to free agency. And once you get there, you've got to have conviction behind what you're doing to be willing and confident to pull the trigger. And we'll see. Ran hasn't been through this, so time will tell. And I'm not saying he can't be good at it. I'm just saying
we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. So experience and perspective matter. We just don't have a track record there to go on.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what he does with this free agency, not because I necessarily am expecting it to be great, but because it's going to be the first really big data point on the Ran Carthon spectrum of knowing what exactly this guy's about. And I think it's going to tell us a lot. Let's dive into what I mentioned earlier. You put out your big project you did last week for The Athletic, the 2024 NFL free agency rankings. You did your top 50, and I heard you on the podcast last week talking about how you told your editors, listen, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to dive into the tape and take this very seriously. And so I know that you know what you're talking about on these guys. Let's start really broad on it. You said this on Twitter. I found this on your Twitter account from a couple of days ago. You said the best players in this year's UFA pool will be on defense, and the best value is on offense. The key for teams is combining the evaluating and the valuing, 2 different processes. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think everybody's going to have their evaluations, right? Everybody's going to have their sequencing of players, whether it's in a position. And in most of the time in free agency, it stays with a position. You don't have the big board like you would in draft preparation.
Right.
So you've got your evaluations that are there. Then you've got to sit down with your cap people, your other financial people, and figure out what makes sense from a value standpoint. How do these contracts that we're considering signing match up to current players' contracts, future players' contracts, our depth chart? How does this work? We don't want a bunch of free agents to come due at the same time. So it is a big puzzle that you got to put all these pieces together in. So I happen to think this year's batch, I don't have it in front of me, but I'll bet you 7 of my top 10 guys were on defense. There's a lot of defensive players. Now, we just entered the area or the time count on the calendar where teams can franchise and transition and use tags. So maybe some of those players will go away because they're going to get tagged by potential teams.
By the way, 8 of your top 10 were defensive players.
There you go. And so that's why I think the premium will be spent on those guys. We know the premiums or the high price guys go that first 3 or 4 days. I would caution fans to coax their own team into that market of overvaluing players just to win the press conference. And like you said, it's the off season. It's nice to win the press conference, but you know what? It really means absolutely nothing. So we got to value what we're doing from an evaluation standpoint and stick to our convictions. The big thing I think for the Titans is they just hired a new coach. And so they have, ever since Brian Callahan was brought on board, they probably, I would assume, have spent time honing in on the criteria for each position and the vision that we're going to use these players on in once we get them. So their criteria that they're looking for with regard to players has totally changed from where it was with Mike Vrabel. At least it should have. Now we're looking now we're looking for a different style, substance, skill set. And so that's, again, a little bit of a leap of faith that they're going to have to make, that they have to all be on the same page when they're valuing these players with regard to how they fit in our scheme.
And of course, you're 100% right. The idea that those first 3 or 4 days of free agency, if your team isn't one of the ones that gets the big names, they're not trying. They don't want to win, right? They're not in it.
Yeah, that's right. And don't forget what we said. Spending does not equal winning. Trust me.
You'd think people would realize this at this point, because it genuinely is every single year. This is an offseason darling. And I can't tell you the last time the offseason darling was the season darling. I
can tell you it never has happened.
Okay, exactly. Yeah. So another thing you said on Twitter, and I want to take this kind of position by position. You said, if your team needs to upgrade their pass rush, your time is here. Very deep and diverse group in this year's UFA pool. And I mean, game-changing group, but don't get your hopes up yet, because franchise tags, of course, have not been handed out. That window opened today. So the next couple of days, we'll find out who will and will not be actually available as free agents. But this pass rush group and the defensive side of the ball in general seems to be the strength of this year's free agency group. Is it just the guys at the top, or is it really a deep group of pass rushing talent?
I think it's a deep group. I think there's 7 or 8 pass rushers here that can make a difference the minute they get off the bus. So I think it's a great group. Now, who gets tagged, I don't know. I mean, Brian Burns, to me, is a really good rusher. Josh Allen,
they tag him, right? Who else are they having to pay besides Brian?
That I don't know. Frankie Louvu, the middle linebacker.
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, it makes sense, but you never know what other contracts are tied to it. You'd think he'd get tagged.
Just seems like the kind of cornerstone player you'd want to start to build around, right?
Well, I know this. Good luck finding another one. So yes, I'm not looking to get rid of good players, nor do I think Dan Morgan is either. So I think they're going to look to keep as many good players as they can. But there is a great group of guys from, I'm just looking at my list here: Zadarius Smith, Leonard Floyd, a bunch of guys. Who am I missing? The Vikings rusher,
Daniil Hunter.
Daniil Hunter. Yep, he's in there. Bryce Huff from the Jets, I think, is an elite rusher. There's some interior guys. There's some interior guys that can rush the passer too. The Ravens are a team that I think have a chance to get raided, whether it's Mandukwe, the tackle, Patrick Queen, their best linebacker, the 2 guys who they signed last of all in Clowney and Van Noy, their 2 edge defenders, are probably valuable to somebody. They played like champs all year long. So it's a deep group of rushers and edge players that I don't see them all getting tagged. That's for sure.
Right. And the Titans, of course, just hired their new defensive coordinator, Darren Wilson, who was a part of that Ravens staff and knows those guys pretty closely. So I'd imagine if he has his eyes on any of them, that they'll be pretty high on the Titans board.
They'll be bidding against Seattle with Mike McDonald as well.
This is true. No kidding.
Yeah, those are the guys that know him the best, and it makes sense that they would be destinations, at least in the recruiting process, for sure.
Well, especially if you're a player like Jadeveon Clowney, who really had kind of a career resurgence this past year, and it was under that guy. I'd imagine he would be incentivized. Let me go keep doing that with that guy, because I know he can get the best out of me, right?
Van Noy as well. Van Noy's been with 4 teams in 3 years, so why not go back with the guy who's got you to this level? And I think that is a great thing about what the Ravens have done, and their coaches now have kind of spread out. They have developed players there, young and some older guys, and that is a great calling card when you're team building as a GM. I know that.
While we're on the defensive side of the ball, I want to ask you about 2 specific players. One that is just now no longer a Titan, but has been with the Titans for a couple of years. And then one guy who's a really big ticket item at a big position in need for the Titans. But let's start with Nico Autry, who you mentioned a moment ago. And when I read your write-up on him in your in your article, he was a guy that kind of surprised you, it sounded like, that you had him as highly as you did, considering his age, the level of production he's put out. Does he strike you as the kind of guy that is worth, even at that concerning age on paper, giving a significant contract to stick around?
Well, again, it's all about options, and there's not going to be a lot of guys who are built like him who can do what he can do. I don't think you can measure his success just on paper either, because this is a kind of guy that can get off blocks. He can eat up tackles. He can eat up space for guys behind him. And I think that is a hard job. It's kind of like a middle reliever in baseball, right? He's an innings eater. And that's what Autry to me is. He'll eat up some innings and make others better around him. So yeah, you have to put an amount on it that maybe you don't go over. But I would think he's worth more to the Titans knowing him than he will be going somewhere else for sure. So I like him. And the reason I said he came out of nowhere was I just hadn't studied Titans players like that before. So I was shocked to find out how good this kid was. And I think he's a good player and a value to anybody who needs an interior guy who can play. He's much like Leonard Williams in Seattle. When you can play, and these guys are 6'4", 6'5" guys, so they can play 5 technique, they can play 3 technique, they can play multiple variety of alignments.
Right, that's not on paper either. The inside-outside versatility means a lot to these coaches,
especially when they're going to play multi-front defenses. And Bill Belichick made a living at it for years, finding the Richard Seymours of the world. These are guys that are built like that can play multiple positions and align in different ways. And I just think they're valuable beyond what we see on paper.
A guy that is going to get a lot of talk, and I don't believe that he is a tag candidate for this team. It sounds like he's going to hit free agency. L'Jarius Sneed is your 13th overall free agent available, and Lord knows the Titans secondary has been the dregs of the league for a couple of seasons now. They need some dudes back there, whether it's in free agency or in the draft. He's somebody that is going to absolutely carry a pretty significant price tag. But I know the Chiefs have another guy that I believe is one of your guys, right? Another guy in that secondary who they're going to have to pay pretty soon. So I'm not sure he's necessarily going to be a guy they can retain as well as some of the other big name players they have to keep around. If Sneed does hit the market, is he somebody to you that is worth going with that top market contract, or is that a risk that you just would be kind of wary of?
Well, again, it all depends on their vision for a team build. He's definitely worth it. His skill set is rare. I think I only had one corner rated ahead of him. To be honest with you, they could have been flipped. The Jalen Johnson kid, the Bears, I think they're both the top of the line, really good players, number one type corners that can help any scheme. I think the difference for me was that Sneed, and I may have said this on my podcast, he had 18 penalties this year. That's a little bit of an undisciplined, a little bit of handsiness that has to go away, because there's some crucial mistakes that his composure weren't there to protect him from. And so that bothered me a little bit. And I saw Johnson as having a little more composure, a little more poise. And that's really the only dividing line I made. But that's a number that's going to be big for either one of those guys. So he kind of goes with that big game hunting attitude that, can one corner really make the difference for us in this team build right now? We might be better served drafting a corner that we can develop that's going to be around in year 2 or 3 when our team is further down the road. I would love to see teams emphasize this. We're going to keep big guys and we're going to keep fast guys. And you can really never go wrong if you stick to that type of a discipline. Now, Sneed is fast. I get it. Would I discourage someone from going after him? Of course not. Corners are really hard to find, but you're going to have to pay a premium, and everybody's price on that tag comes with a price tag that some will swallow and some won't.
The answer to this question may just be no, but I want to ask, do you subscribe to any specific philosophy from a positional value standpoint where there are some certain positions you're more comfortable giving a premium contract to than others?
100%, always. And same in drafting too. And again, I'm going to sound like I'm picking on positions, but I'm probably not going to pay a guard. Probably not going to pay a safety a ton. I might not pay an inside linebacker that doesn't rush the passer a ton. You can't pay everybody. And those are just my personal philosophical kind of ideas. Somebody might think totally different than that. I'm going to draft tackles. I might sign a center who's been through the wars before and is a communicator and a glue guy up front,
Yep.
a leader.
Mhm.
I'm going to fill in at guard. I'm going to draft edge rushers. I might draft a corner or two, no doubt, and kind of fill in some other areas. So yeah, positional priority means a lot to me. Just from my perspective, you can't pay them all. Second contracts are really hard to pay, even when those guys are really good at those less than priority positions.
The Titans have needs all over the field, obviously, and looking at the other side of the ball, offensive line and wide receiver are two big ones for them, two premium areas that you have to be competent at to be able to compete in the NFL. Looking at those two markets in this free agency cycle, I would say it's a bad year for offensive line, but has there been a good year in a while? Really, it's just such a sparse. The teams that find the good ones tend not to let them go. Let's just say that.
100%.
What do you make of those two markets this year as you've looked at the top free agents that are available?
I think offensive line is probably the least attractive group to me. I think the guy who is at the top of my list is a kid that plays for the Raiders now, who is technically not even a tackle, but he's done a great job there. And so they may end up signing him to keep him as a tackle. Another offensive lineman in New England who is really a guard is playing right tackle for them. Tackles are sparse. Yeah, they're sparse. You cannot find these guys. That's why you got to draft them and you got to hang on to them. So if you can find a good tackle out there, great. Just look at the Chiefs, and it's hard to disparage what the Chiefs did. They won the championship, but they paid a ton of money to tackles that, in my opinion, aren't very good. They struggled in the Super Bowl big time and throughout the playoffs. So
highly penalized.
To think you can make somebody else's discards good in your system, I think that's a reach, and there's a leap of faith there that doesn't work more times than it works, for sure.
Not to take us too far off the topic at hand, but you sparked a thought just then. A lot has been made since the Titans have hired Brian Callahan. He brings in his dad, who is regarded as one of the best, if not the best, offensive line coaches in the NFL, and Bill Callahan. Do you feel like having a guy like that in the building is something that you can factor into the math of your team building? In other words, having a guy like him gives you more faith that he can make do with maybe not the best set of guys? Or is that a dangerous game?
I don't think it's a dangerous game at all. And when I heard Brian Callahan was even a candidate somewhere else, the first thing I thought about was it's a 2-for-1. It's a 2-for-1. Whoever gets him is going to get Bill too. And I think it is a great value, not a good value, a great value. Because I think the offensive line coach beyond your coordinators is the next most important hire.
Really?
And Bill comes with that experience, but also he'll be a guy that can say, Brian, what the hell are you thinking about? We're not doing that. Stop. That's a bad idea.
Right.
And most coaches aren't going to stand up to the boss. They just aren't. But this guy will stand up to his kid. Trust me.
When it's your son,
yeah, he's going to have a great advantage, in my opinion, for doing that. So I think it's awesome. I thought that this would happen. Some people were shocked that Cleveland let him go. I would not ever keep a dad from working with his son. It's a lifetime.
Who's going to do that?
Yeah, once in a lifetime deal. So it makes a lot of sense. But then the fact that Bill's so good at his job is excellent. And I don't know about doing more with less, but I know this, that the pass protection schemes will be solid. We don't have to worry about that at all.
Right.
He'll do more than just coach technique for the offensive line. So they're getting, I don't know what they're paying Bill, but he's worth all of it. That's for sure.
I believe it. Looking at this wide receiver group, a number of these guys are free agent in maybe name only. T. Higgins, a poorly kept secret that he's going to get tagged. It sounds like Michael Pittman Jr. is somebody that is a tag candidate. Calvin Ridley, not a tag candidate, but somebody that may or may not stick around with Jacksonville. So it looks like a pretty good list when you just look at it without any context. But when you realize that a number of these top names may not actually be available for the signing, it becomes kind of sparse, right? Then you get to Josh Reynolds, Gabe Davis, OBJ, Hollywood Brown, those second tier guys. When you were watching them and grading them as free agent prospects, what did you make of that second group of receivers?
My group will be different than yours because my criteria is different. So that's in the eyes of the beholder, and who knows what teams have made their criteria. I'm not I'm looking for guys that can really run. That's just my vision on the offense that I want. I want guys that can go. And for me, there are some of those guys that can really go that won't be tagged. Michael Pittman, you can't argue with production. T. Higgins can't argue with production. But these guys aren't viewed as burners, as guys that defenses have to defend differently, like some of these other guys. And I think overall, it's not a great group. It's a bunch of possession guys, big guys, catch when they're covered guys, Pittman's, Mike Evans, T. Higgins, those guys. But you got a guy in Chicago like Darnell Mooney.
I was about to say, you immediately made that make sense to me when you said, I prefer the guys that can run. I'm like, that's why he has Mooney as his second guy.
That's why I have OBJ in the mix. That's why I have Calvin Ridley in the mix, because those guys can go. Defenses have to defend you differently with speed, and speed means a lot to me. It's funny you mentioned that. We're going to put out at The Athletic the rest of this week our position lists, and I'll have to write a little disclaimer for each position list saying exactly what I'm looking for, which may be different than what the Titans are looking for.
Totally.
Maybe different than what Easton or JT is looking for. That's all right. This is just what I want. It is part of my vision. I don't necessarily want slower, bigger guys. I want guys that can really run. Otherwise, I think we're spinning our wheels. So it all depends on the criteria that you want for each of these positions and the offense that you're going to ask them to in kind of meld their skill set in with. So I hope that makes sense to people. It's not that I don't like T. Higgins as a player. I think he's great. He's just not what I'm looking for with regard to speed, explosiveness, ability to get away from people, just that ability to separate suddenly. Those things mean more to me than other evaluators.
And I'm sure you'd agree with this, that what matters above all else is, like you mentioned earlier, Brian Callahan sitting down with Ran Carthon and that staff, and they are making sure they're crystal clear on what exactly they're looking for the fit to what Callahan is trying to run, right? Whatever that may be.
And it happens with both sides of the ball. You've got to have your criteria, and it's going to be different than Easton and JT and Randy's. It's going to be totally different. That's the one thing about putting together one of these lists for The Athletic like we did. We're not building a team. We don't have our own philosophy. That part's not real. We don't have a team that we're fitting these guys into. So it's really mine and the guys who helped me with it. It's our vision. And so another one of these NFL teams will have a total different vision. So it might not make sense to them. It's just in the eyes of the beholder. That's all.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Randy, this was really delightful. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time and some of your fantastic insight. He is Randy Mueller. You can check out all of his work over at The Athletic and on the Football GM podcast on the Athletic Podcasts Network. 2000 NFL Executive of the Year. He knows his stuff. Randy, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, guys. I enjoyed it. Anytime, reach out.
That is the Hot Read Podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you tuned in with us live, if you're listening late, we thank you for being here anyways. Make sure you subscribe to Broadway Sports Media's YouTube page while you're over there. We'll be back on Thursday previewing the Combine. Randy, are you going to be at the Combine? Is that something?
I am.
All right. Fantastic. So maybe we will see you there, and we'll have to get you a drink as a thank you for joining us on the show today. Until then, for my co-host JT and our guest Randy, I'm your host Easton Freeze. This has been the Hot Read Podcast. We'll talk to you later this week.